Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help.
Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about asexuality. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have two amazing people from UCF, or the University of Central Florida. First, we have Jax Rogero. Jax uses they, them pronouns and works as an administrative assistant at UCF and is completing a gender studies certificate. They have one son and frequently uses him as an excuse for a serious cartoon watching habit. So Jax, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Ava Devine. Ava uses they, she pronouns, and Ava is a second-year creative writing and French student at UCF. They're a passionate reader, a proud member of Lavender Council, and a full-time cat mom. In her free time, Ava loves to watch movies and care for her Animal Crossing village, which I love. I know Alexa is a big Animal Crossing person. So Ava, thank you so much for being here too.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to be here.
And finally, we have returning Alexa Andino. Alexa uses she, her pronouns and is our therapy intern here at VSC. Alexa identifies as asexual and is a master's student pursuing her degree in clinical mental health counseling. Alexa hopes to graduate in December of 2020 and work as a registered mental health counselor, intern, and advocate for sexual abuse survivors and the LGBTQIA+ community. So Alexa, thank you so much for being, I think this is your third podcast with us, right?
I think so. I lost track. Either third or fourth, but I'm super excited to be here again.
It's always a pleasure to have you, and I'm really, really excited to have this conversation with all of you today. It's a really important topic. As a really brief introduction, on this podcast, we have talked about the LGBTQ+ community in general, but we have not discussed those that identify as asexual or ace at all. According to some studies, at least 1% of the adult population is asexual, though that number could be higher due to various reasons, including lack of awareness of asexuality, or there not being many studies, let alone recent studies done on this community at all. So that being said, this year, ACE Week is from October 25th to October 31st, which is when this podcast is set to come out. And we decided to have this episode really focus on what it means to be ACE, what are some common misconceptions surrounding the ACE community, and how we can be better advocates for ACE folks. So with that in mind, and anyone can jump in at any time, to start off, how would you define asexuality?
For me, being ACE has been a big learning thing. So defining it has been kind of weird. Definitely the stereotypical way that I've always described it is that asexuality is this, lack of sexual interest in people. And then I know that we'll just probably talk about it being a spectrum, but as of just asexuality is talking about this lack of sexual desire.
Got it. Do you, Ava, or you, Alexa, want to hop in on that at all?
Yeah, like I totally agree with the asexuality definition that Jax gave, that it's a lack of sexual attraction towards anyone. And I feel like just because asexuality isn't on a spectrum and it's different for everyone, that sometimes the definition can just easily go over someone's head. So being ace myself, I definitely heard the definition. I knew what asexuality was, but whenever I would read it, the definition, it would just kind of go over my head and I didn't identify with it. So sometimes when someone just hears that definition, it doesn't resonate as quickly.
That's a really good point. And that kind of brings me to, what you were saying earlier, Jax, which is I know when it comes to things like sexuality, and I think perhaps we could probably argue with most things, it exists on a spectrum. So could you talk a little bit about asexuality as it pertains to a spectrum?
So I know that a lot the familiar term for me has been aspec. So talking about this spectrum, or an umbrella term even, that includes gray ace, demi, it falls under it. And so it's this talking about people need to have an emotional connection before they can have a sexual one, that there's a different degree of sexual willingness. So some people are sex repulsed, some people are able to have a sexual relationship with their partner or partners or people. So for example, I have a son. I'm still ace, and I have always been ace. So it's definitely people populate this. I know there's the Kinsey scale, but there's a quadrant sexuality. And so there's like this whole space that people can occupy that is still within the ace sphere or spectrum. But it just kind of is falling on perhaps like how it looks for each person and what it means and how it manifests.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that. That makes a lot of sense. And, you brought up some terms, and maybe, Ava or Alexa want to jump in on these. You mentioned demisexuality. I've heard of gray sexuality. So are these all under the umbrella of ACE, or are they completely separate?
I would definitely put them under the umbrella. So asexuality is like the umbrella, and then under it is all these identities that compose of asexuality. So I know Jax is saying like demisexual is you need to have an emotional bond before you can be sexual with anyone. So if you have that, if you are like that, then you might identify as demi, or there is gray ace where you might fall between ace and sexual. So it kind of is just flowing somewhere in between. Some people, maybe when they're questioning, they might identify as gray ace just because they're not fully sure how they identify. And then there's a bunch of other ones where I'm not sure if I would even be pronouncing them correctly, but there's reciprocal sexual. So this is described as someone who does not experience sexual romantic attraction to someone until they know that person is attracted to them. Or there's a coy sexual attraction fades if reciprocated, and then ace flux. So that's fluctuating between the asexual spectrum and the sexual spectrum. And there's a bunch of other ones, but I like that it is a spectrum because, you can fit into the asexuality umbrella because everyone's going to be different.
Yeah, kind of building off of that, a lot of times when people hear about demisexuality, they get a little confused because so was saying, demisexual people need that very strong emotional and like mental connection with someone before they experience sexual attraction. And a lot of times, especially when I've found, like when I talk to older people like my parents, they're like, oh, that's normal, that's how everyone feels. Like you need to know someone before you want to have sex with them. But there's a difference between like your attraction to someone and like your desire to have sex with them. So like whereas you may be walking down the street and like see someone who you're physically attracted to very strongly, even if you don't know them and you probably wouldn't want to just like jump into bed with someone, a demisexual person might not even experience that physical attraction at all until they have come to know that person emotionally. And that itself is a spectrum, right? It could be someone needs a month to get to know someone needs years, it could fluctuate for them. So it's important to see that pretty much every identity under asexual is also a spectrum, and it's very personal from person to person.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I have at times, and I go back and forth because the definition is hard. I've identified as actually demisexual, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I do share that with people, and they do say that, oh yeah, me too, and I'm like, okay, like maybe, but I agree that there is a difference between, no, I literally do not have sexual attraction until I have that. And that's different than wanting to actually partake in sexual intercourse with someone. So I really appreciate you saying that.
I like to think of it like when people say like, when people who are demi, they might think of a one night stand and they're confused by it because it's like, how do you just, jump into bed with someone you find sexually attractive? I think that's a component that I like to explain. Like someone who's demi isn't going to like face that attraction and doesn't really understand what a one night stand is, because they're going to need that emotional bond before.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, as you were talking about with personalness, I think, sometimes I do have sexual attraction to people that I don't have. It depends. It fluctuates too, but most of the time it's more of that demisexual part of it. So I appreciate, that conversation. Thank you for bringing that up. Going off of that, and of course, what you were mentioning too, Jax, you have a son. Are there times where those that identify themselves as ace engage in things like masturbation, consuming porn, or sex?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest jokes kind of in some fandom communities with fan fiction is like the best smut writers are ace. And it's been something I've definitely seen. One of the reasons actually why it took me so long to figure out that I myself was asexual is because it was very easy for me to fall into bed with people, because it was just, I hadn't yet broken from this expectation of like a sexual physical relationship. Like that was just something that you do when you're in a relationship. So I've actually had like, multiple partners. Like I thought I was polyamorous maybe, or, like it didn't matter to me. It was very sex positive, and, being with someone, like I just hadn't yet separated this idea that yes, am sex positive. Yes, I'm willing to have this type of relationship. I'm not repulsed by it. But there's a difference between that and desire and like being like sexually attracted to someone. And that took me forever to figure out. It was in high school. Had multiple confusing conversations about masturbation and I now identify as agender, but in high school I thought I was a cisgender woman, and I thought maybe it's just this like female thing that women don't masturbate, and no one ever talks about it. So like maybe it's just normal. So definitely ace people masturbate, they have sex, they consume porn, they will create it. I mean, again, like this, smut writers have been hysterical whenever I talk to them because they're like, I get all hot and heavy for holding hands and not, this other stuff. And it's something that definitely it's like a checklist of you can hit 9 out of 10 of these things, but it's just that sexual attraction that makes you ace.
I love that you brought that up, Jax, too, because I feel like in my experience of being ace, just kind of society's expectations of you have to have sex with people, just like jump into bed with a person that likes you and things like that. I found myself young, doing that because I thought that's what a relationship was like. And I think that's what makes it confusing for people who identify as ace, just because of this societal, expectation that you need to be a sexual being. You don't really hear that it's okay and that people are not sexual, so I definitely, resonate with what you were saying. And then just to add on to that as well, like, just knowing that like some asexuals still get that pent up energy, or they might still feel horny. Some aces don't have any libido, but some still have that natural libido. But it's, choosing to maybe satisfy that libido within yourself when they masturbate or watch porn. knowing that that's valid and you're still ace. And if you do have sex, that's totally okay as well. Some aces might, want to have sex for emotional needs. They might have partners who identify as allo, which means someone who is sexual. And they might, want to satisfy partners' needs. They might want to get emotional needs from having sex, knowing that just like how we're talking about, it's really different for everyone.
Yeah, I think Alexa and Jax put it perfectly. I myself don't identify as ace, but I do have several friends who do. And I think we've had like some great conversations just like within our friend groups in order to better understand what asexuality is. And I had one friend actually explain it to me as because they're in a relationship with someone who's allosexual. Like Alexa said, that means you do experience sexual attraction, but they're ace, and they told me that the way they feel about sex is kind of like how someone might feel like doing the dishes for their partner or doing laundry for them. Whereas it's not like something they have a desire for, but it's not something they mind doing because they know it makes their partner feel good. And so I think there's a lot of stigma surrounding asexuality in the LGBTQ plus community. And, a lot of people are really quick to jump to, oh, if you masturbate or you have sex, you're not really ace. But that's really a harmful stereotype to pose because asexuality is such a spectrum that, a lot of ace people have sex. And there's also a lot of ace people who don't, and both are equally as valid of identities as the other.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And, that actually, I'm going to go a little out of order with the questions that I sent. So I apologize because we're already kind of getting into, can those identify as ace be in relationships? And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, maybe that struggle. Do those that identify as ace often struggle explaining their sexuality to their partners?
Yeah, I can definitely imagine how scary it is. I know with my partner, it was definitely scary. I have a very loving partner, but it was still scary because especially if you're in a relationship and you are sexual with that partner, and then to all of a sudden, recognize your identity, or even beforehand, I think there's just so much stigma with not wanting to have sex, and feeling like a burden or less of, or wondering if anyone would love me. I think those are common thoughts that can come to someone who's ace, and being with someone who is allosexual. I think that can be really difficult, but I feel like the key is just active communication and recognizing that both sides of the relationship have valid equal needs, so that, if someone decides to leave you because important to them, I think that's okay, because that is a need that they need in their life, just like a need for someone who doesn't want to have sex, but if you do want to work together with a partner who is allosexual, it's all about communicating those needs and, negotiating every time, knowing that, it's a yes or a no each time, you decide to, ask for sex or to have sex with your partner.
Yeah, and I wanted to also kind of talk a little bit about that expectation that everyone was kind of highlighting about needing to be sexual, especially in a sexual community that, that we're in. Do you all think that idea of kind of, when you talked about like being ace and still being sexual with a partner because you want to, make them feel good, that kind of thing. Do you think there's any issues with that when it comes to like coercion or consent at all? Or am I just not understanding what it's like to be ace? Do you know what I mean?
I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for the ace community as someone who doesn't identify within it, but as someone who identifies as allosexual or is allosexual, and if I were to be in a relationship with an ace person, how I would approach it, I think that it's really important to acknowledge both people's needs at the front of the relationship, or as soon as you're comfortable talking about it with someone, right? You want to give the person who's ace, maybe they're not comfortable coming out to you immediately. So having that conversation as soon as possible so you can lay out like your needs in the relationship. And of course, if it is and isn't interested in engaging in sex, or is sex repulsed, and like that's something that I would feel comfortable working with and trying to find other ways to make our relationship feel satisfied. Because I think there are non-sexual ways you can like satisfy that same part of the relationship, and ways that can make everyone in the relationship still happy and comfortable. I think that's the most important thing to think about, is that I agree sex should never be expected. It should never be a mandatory part of a relationship, especially if it's not something someone is comfortable or interested in. So just making sure everyone's needs and are heard and validated is really important.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think just like normalizing, this communication and boundaries thing, just with any relationship, just because if two sexual people are in a relationship doesn't mean that you have to give that person sex whenever they want. Just to look at it that way, it's always going to be a consent where, you ask the person, maybe you just don't feel like having sex in that moment if you're two sexual beings in a relationship, and that should be okay. You have to respect the other person's consent. And I think that is the same thing that goes with being in a relationship with someone who identifies as ace. It's definitely just going to be dependent on the situation and the time that it's happening. It's when people are married, it doesn't mean that, oh, now that, let's say a heterosexual couple, like the man expects the woman to just have sex with him all the time because they're married. It's like, no, that's not the case. So kind of normalizing that. It's like that in every relationship, is talking about, these rules and, these boundaries, because everyone has a different libido, regardless if you're ace or not. You might have a partner who has a higher libido than you, but maybe you guys still don't identify as ace, and you might still have a lot of the same communications that maybe someone who is ace will have with their partner.
I think people are just also very awkward about consent. Whenever I've come out to partners after I found out, I'll say it that way. So it was like retroactively, we had a conversation about it. There were a lot of hangups of like, so you didn't find me attractive? And there was that, or, there's the joke, right, of like, so do you wanna ... And technically the answer to that question is always going to be no. I am willing to have a sexual relationship, but I have zero libido. So it's always going to be no. But I had to explain to a previous partner that it was like, but if you asked me, like, so do you want a back rub? Back rubs feel great. I will always say yes. And that's kind of the same thing, is I have the same physiology, right, as like lots of people on this planet. And it's fine. It feels fine. I just don't have whatever psychological or emotional or however else you want to call it, like that attachment to it. But I feel like a lot of people are just awkward talking about it in a relationship because I don't even know how to explain it, because I don't know. I don't understand why they would be awkward about something like that. But, it was just always this moment where it kind of took me like, 2 days later, I'd be like, oh, that's what they were asking for. And I just didn't. And so, because again, if they say, so do you wanna, and it's no, then it stops, and they go away with one impression and I have another one. So, of course, all of us have said this, but communication, being clear, not making it awkward, because like, sex is ridiculous. It's, you're going to be vulnerable. You're going to be, exposed. So I think getting that out of the way is also just a great way to make that relationship better, no matter how you identify, if that's something that you're wanting to pursue.
I love how Jax phrased that. I think they like characterized it perfectly, and it's something we don't talk about enough. Whether you're in a relationship with an ace person or not, like the way you ask for consent is going to vary based on who you're with, and that's a really important conversation to have, because someone may not be comfortable asking or responding in a certain way all the time, and so understanding boundaries about sex and understanding how to go about asking for consent in a way that makes both people comfortable and acknowledges their needs is so important. And I think it's definitely something that's not discussed within relationships enough, or just in general. Like, there's such a big stigma around how you ask for consent, and a lot of people really struggle with that, and it's a critical part in sexual relationships.
what I'm hearing a lot is just the individuality of how to communicate with your partner, you know, and meeting them halfway. So I really appreciate that part of the conversation. You have been throwing out different terms such as sex repulsed. And I wanted to, before we move forward, kind of talk a little bit about different aspects of just sexuality in general. So could, and anyone can jump in, define the difference between like sexual attraction, sexual behavior, maybe aesthetic attraction, and then I'd really like to talk about celibacy as well, since I think that that is a common topic when people think about ACE, which I believe that there's a little bit of a difference there. So anyone can jump in on that.
Yeah, I'll definitely jump in and answer these questions. So with sexual attraction, it's finding someone sexually appealing and wanting to have sex with that person. So kind of like glancing at that person and saying they're very sexy, I could jump into bed with them. And this is something that is not controlled. And how I like to put it for the difference between sexual attraction and sexual behavior is that sexual behavior is controlled, where it demonstrates how humans express sexuality. So this can be through, you know, like blowjobs, kissing, having sex with two or more people. It's these activities of sex is what sex behavior is. Well, attraction is kind of just inner, like having that feeling that you find someone sexy. So, you know, different ACEs can feel different ways about this. You know, I know like Emilie, you were saying that, you know, you identify as demi. So sometimes you find people sexually attractive, and then sometimes no, like you need that emotional connection. So it's really different for everyone. And then for aesthetic attraction, you know, a lot of ACEs can have aesthetic attraction. So this is a form of physical attraction to a person's appearance. So this can be kind of the way someone looks or how they present themselves. So it can be, I like to describe it as like looking at like a nice painting or landscape where you like to talk about the features, like, oh, they have a very attractive jawline, or they have great lips, or whatever is physically on that person. You know, it's not like I find them really sexy and I want to jump into bed with them. It's like I appreciate how they look. And then for celibacy, it's choosing not to engage in any sexual behaviors because maybe of some religious or moral purposes. But I definitely would love to hear from you guys if there's any other definitions that you guys would like to explore or add on to.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on celibacy as well. I think that a lot of times people confuse asexuality and celibacy a little bit. And the important difference is celibacy is a choice and asexuality is not. So your sexuality is how you experience attraction in a sexual context to other people. And that's not something you choose. That is just how, you know, your brain and your body work. And celibacy is an active choice. So that's saying, you know, I don't want to engage in sex until I'm married or until I have been with this person for X amount of time, or ever even. But you can certainly be celibate and ace. If you can be asexual and be, you know, experience some level of sexual attraction, but be celibate for whatever reason. Like Alexa said, it could be a moral or religious reason. But they don't always coincide, and one is definitely just who a person is and the other is a choice they make.
Thank you for breaking that down and all those terms there. I also wanted to ask exactly, and I think I might understand the definition, but just for our viewers, of just kind of delving into like sexual repulsed. I think that was a term that you all used. Can anyone kind of just talk a little bit about that?
So for what I've understood it as is in conversation with other ACE people, it's, you know, with a lot of things, if you're averse to something, so I'm touch adverse or touch repulsed. So I don't like it when people will come up behind me and like put their hand on my shoulder. So I'm not even talking about like the weird creepy on my lower back thing, but I mean, just like, I don't like handshakes. I don't really like hugs. I'm not a big fan of this like physical contact. It just kind of, it gives me this weird feeling, and that I just try to like avoid all of that. And so in conversation with some others, so sex repulsed or sex averse, ace people, it's the same kind of thing. We're just like the thought of it, having conversations about it is just kind of makes them upset or like sick feeling. They just want to avoid it as much as possible. They probably do not consume porn. They probably do not masturbate. They probably do not have a physical relationship with someone because it's just not, that's something that just very much gives them distress to think about or to participate in.
Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge everyone who's in this conversation right now, and thank you for being so vulnerable about your sexuality and sharing your own experiences with it. I really appreciate the openness in this conversation. So thank you so much for that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how people who are listening right now might start relating to this definition of asexuality, and under that umbrella, I think that it's definitely a relatable thing. And that being said, how can people know if they are ace?
I'm like trying to remember how I figured it out. I think because again, I was a very sexual person for a while, and so I had assumed that I was just like everybody else. And I am trying really hard to remember at what point I was like, oh, no, this is not how it works for other people. Because it was definitely after I had my son. And I feel like, I'm going to step back and see if someone else can, because I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's like a hard question just because it's individualized, like we talked about. But and correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess it's just kind of like, as you see, like sex is like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs as like those basic needs you need to survive, like food, water, shelter. And if you think like I don't have to have sex for the rest of my life and I would be totally okay by it, it's kind of like how I identify as that's not a basic need that I need. So that was one way I was able to identify. And it took me a while too. Like I recently just started identifying and, I just kind of blurted it out. And then my therapist was like, oh, well, let's talk about that more. And it was, I guess, just through education as well. There's a really great website. It's called GLAAD. I believe it's with 2A's, GLAAD.org, and they have the whole asexuality spectrum there for you to look at, and also the Trevor Project. So basically, if any of these things that are coming up for our listeners are kind of maybe ringing a bell and you want to look more into it, I would definitely look into all of, those websites and just see if you identify with anything that comes up, because I don't ever want to tell someone like, it sounds like you're asexual. I want someone to identify it themselves.
Yeah, I think too, I guess I'm speaking right outside as someone outside the ace spectrum, but I would assume it's similar to coming to terms with any sexual or gender or sexuality or gender that you end up identifying with. So I recently started using they, she pronouns instead of just she, her pronouns. And for me, it was an exposure to other people who identified with that label and didn't identify as cis, and exposure to media about or media written by and about people who use different pronouns and identify outside of cisgender. So I would say if it's something that you're questioning, expose yourself to as much of that media as possible. Read different people's accounts of how they feel being asexual or identifying within any of the asexual spectrum. And if you share a lot of those feelings, it could be something that you feel comfortable identifying with. But yeah, the exposure to just other people, having conversations with people that identify as something that you think you might want to identify with is one of the most beneficial ways, I think, to help you along that journey, because it can be a really scary and really confusing one. And the more media and more people you talk to, it can help you along that path a little bit.
I love that you said it was a journey, because I can see how it definitely can be, especially as we talk more about it. And I'm really glad that we're having this space because I'm learning so much from all of you here. And I hope that people who are listening are able to take away a lot here and help them on that journey. And for us to just understand other human beings around us, right? It's really important that we're good supporters for people like that too. I've also heard of other terms such as aromantic. So what is the difference between that and asexuality?
So I am also Arrow. So I'm Ace Arrow, and it's whenever I was going through and figuring everything out, I've just become null and void, as I like to put it. Like I have no gender, I have no sexual like desire, and then this concept of like aromanticism is I do not desire to have a romantic relationship with anybody as well. It's something that I can do and that I have done, but it's not something that I feel needs to be a part of my. Bringing up the Maslow's hierarchy of needs was brilliant. I love that because it is exactly that. Like I don't need that in my life to make myself feel any sort of fulfillment. I have had to evaluate the people and relationships in my life because everyone's telling me that I'm missing something. You know, I'm in my 30s and I'm single, and so obviously I need something. But I have friends that I'm so close to that they make my life feel full and feel like it's worth what I'm doing every day. And so being aromantic, and again, it's a spectrum, it's an umbrella term. There are things that fall under that, but it's nothing that I feel a need to take into my life to make my life better or richer than it already is.
Yeah, I guess jumping like into just more definitions, right, for the sake of anyone who's listening and maybe a little confused. So there is a distinct difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. In that sexual attraction is your desire or lack of desire to have sex with someone or have a sexual relationship with someone. Romantic attraction is your desire or lack thereof to have a romantic relationship with someone. So someone could be asexual, but still identify with a romantic attraction, right? They could still experience romantic attraction and want an emotional romantic relationship with someone, just maybe without sex. The reverse is also true. Someone could be, for example, homosexual and aromantic. They could enjoy sex, they could love having sex, but they don't experience any of the romantic emotional tie to other people, or they experience like a smaller amount of it, right? Jax spoke about aromantic also being a spectrum. So yeah, I guess I just always like to draw attention to those two differences because when you talk about sexuality and romantic attraction, people can get a little bit confused.
I really appreciate you both, of course, for sharing that. Thank you so much. But also flipping it on the other side of someone being sexual, but arrow, because as someone who is where that romantic aspect is really important, I didn't even think of that. So I really appreciate that could definitely be the case too. And I just feel like my mind has been blown. So I appreciate that a lot. In addition to that, we've talked a lot about how, ACE, why do you think it's really not well known? Why is it not talked about or recognized as other sexualities in the LGBTQ plus community?
I think that, right, I'm going to relate it to gender again. So it can be very difficult for people to imagine like situations and identities that they don't associate with. And especially when those genders and sexualities are the norm. So as it may be very difficult for a heterosexual man to imagine being attracted to another man, or for a cisgender person to imagine being trans, I think it's really difficult for people who are allosexual to imagine a life where they don't experience sexual desire, or they experience a really low sexual desire. And actually a lot of the most empathetic people I've talked to who are not asexual but are very empathetic to the community are people who have experienced like a really, at some point in their life, like really low libido, whether it be because of birth control or a postpartum condition or anything like that. And obviously they aren't the same thing, but it's hard to imagine until you've experienced it. So because for so many people, sex is such a big part of their life and their relationships, the idea of not experiencing that desire just can seem really foreign and scary. And we have this tendency to kind of compartmentalize what we don't understand into like the others, which is a really detrimental thing. And that's why so much of the LGBTQ plus community can be so divided, is because we fear what we do not know. So I really appreciate Emilie opening up this podcast to talking about asexuality, because it's not like some scary other thing. It's just it's an identity that other people have and that deserves to be respected and validated.
I also want to point out that a lot of people, as Ava was saying about, the most empathetic went through something similar, and so they were able to relate. But I think that's another point of people see asexuality as a symptom of something else. I was constantly being tested for my hormone level, because it's, whenever I would go to the doctor and they'd be like, well, how's your libido? Like, how's your physical or your sexual activity? Like, how do you feel? And it's like, well, I don't want to. And it's like, well, let's test your hormones, or, are you eating? Are you sleeping? And then also, I don't know if this is going to open up a can of worms, but, I'm a CSA survivor. And so, people are like, well, obviously you don't have this desire because you were abused. And it's this mentality of like, was I born this way or was I made this way? And does it really matter either way? Because I am who I am. I think that that's something that people almost view as if it were a choice, that I am purposefully identifying this way so that I don't get hurt again, or something psychological, you know what I mean? So it's been something that gets talked about as a symptom of something else. It's hormonal, it's a psychological thing. I know with my gender identity is part of the DSM for my borderline personality disorder, right? So if you have a weird gender identity, then that's a symptom. And I feel like anything that falls under, very similar to how homosexuality used to be professionally seen, and now still socially, we still have these issues, these stigmas, where gay men were obviously abused and they're going to spread the abuse or something. I feel like asexuality still suffers from the same kind of mentality, where it's a symptom of something and is just something that needs to be corrected either through medication or therapy.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And that really puts a different perspective on it. And I really appreciate you opening up about that. And for those listening, from what I understand, CSA means child sexual abuse, right, Jax?
That is correct.
For those listening, yeah, CSA is child sexual abuse. And that is such an interesting way of looking at asexuality, of people thinking that it is a symptom of something that needs to be fixed. And that kind of goes back to all, like you were mentioning, all of the different letters in the LGBTQ plus community, I think, have gone through this, right? Of homosexuality as something that needs to be fixed. And then, of course, the trans community, I feel like they believe that, oh, well, are you really trans? We need to make sure before we do gender, non-conform, before we do hormones, that kind of thing. And I appreciate you saying that, because, of course, I just want everyone listening here that your sexuality, your gender is not something that needs to be fixed. It is what it is. And we at the VSC accept you for whoever you are, however you identify. Your sexuality and your gender is not something that needs to be fixed. So I really appreciate you saying all that, Jax. Alexa, as a therapy intern at the VSC who works with survivors of sexual violence, how does someone know they are asexual if they have gone through something like sexual trauma? And actually, Jax mentioning their background as well. That makes sense.
My mind is just blown, Jax, because I also identify as ace, and also I'm a child sexual abuse survivor, and I actually never met anyone who was ace before, even though we're meeting virtually. And then also to find out you're a survivor as well. I think that's just very comforting, and knowing that there's a lot of us out there, but, definitely I think what like Jax was saying, it was definitely difficult to differentiate the two. But usually when I do have clients come in, I just like to explain that there's going to be no direct causation when it comes to being asexual. Just like when someone is heterosexual, no one asks you, how do you really know if you're heterosexual? There's no gene or trait to determine, what your identity is. You are valid either way. So if you're ace because you were born ace or because of your assault, I just like to say for whatever reason you identify as ace, that it's valid, that you can still identify as ace or aro, even if you think something may have caused a lack of attraction that you have, but knowing that in reality, we're really never going to know what causes these things. It's more just we're embracing who we are. Like Emilie was saying, it is what it is. And, if someone really wants to kind of differentiate the two, I know I was a lot like that because I'm more of a, logistical person and only see things in black and white. But in reality, it's not really like that. But I do like to maybe ask some questions, like how people who are asexual or maybe who are questioning it, how they view it. So some questions I might ask survivors of sexual abuse who might think they're asexual is, how do they consider, having sex? Do they think they can go their whole life with having sex? If they think of sex, is it more of a neutral or appalling connotation with it rather than fear? Because some sexual abuse survivors might just be scared of having sex again, and that's valid. But if maybe there's no fear component to it, unless you're sex repulsed, which is, totally something different, or if, you might have sex for emotional reasons rather than physical. So, if any of those questions, you might be answering yes to, then I would definitely look into asexuality. But just the big picture I just like to have is that if you don't experience sexual attraction after your rape or assault, you can still identify as ace and know that it could change since sexuality is fluid.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And both you and Jax, thanks for sharing about your stories as well. I really appreciate that. Ava, we talked a little bit about it, but could you tell us a little bit about what the Lavender Council at UCF is?
Of course. We get a lot of questions about this, actually. A lot of people are like, are you a club? Like, what do you do? Are you a bunch of gay people that just hang out? So Lavender Council is an on-campus organization. We are technically not like a club, something like that. It is a council, essentially, of LGBTQ plus students. We have a graduate assistant and then kind of like a overseer of it all, who right now is Michael Nunes. And we work with LGBTQ plus policy and issues on campus. We do a lot of education. So we do advocates, which is basically just teaching allies how to help advocate for the community. We do Gold, which is like a more in-depth look at different genders and sexualities and advocacy. And we just recently introduced our coming out Safe Zone, which talks about like what coming out is, why it's an important thing in the community. So that's actually a really big part of what we do. We've educated everything from like sororities. We're educating the UCF PD right now. And we even go to like some high school GSAs, so smaller ones as well. So education's a big part of it. We help partner with events going on campus to make sure that LGBTQ plus people are being represented there. So if you've ever been, our two big events are Drag Divas and Lavender Brunch. If you've ever been to either of those, if you're a student, we also sometimes we partner with organizations like APAC just to table at their events. We do a lot with CAB and we do a lot with MSC as well on campus. And yeah, we also spend a lot of time in the Pride spaces. So obviously we're kind of isolated right now, but we have two Pride spaces on campus, which is Pride Commons, which is in Farrell Commons. And then we also are in SJA, which is on the second floor of the Student Union. So it's a big thing. We do a lot. We do event planning, we do personal projects, we do presenting, education, policy, and it's a really, really great way to be involved on campus. Michael always says it's kind of like a stepping stone towards greater advocacy work. So term limits for Lavender Council are generally 2 years, and then they want to push you towards advocacy in another element on campus. And it's a really great I think, starting place for people who want to be more involved and change the community, especially on campus and in the Orlando area.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It sounds like y'all do a lot, which is amazing. And I think that's really interesting that there's a term limit, because perhaps they want you to go out and kind of advocate further in other aspects instead of just kind of like staying in one area, if that makes sense. I assume that that's why they do that. But I wanted to ask you specifically how your experience being on the Lavender Council helped shape the way you view asexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a sophomore at UCF, and coming into my freshman year, I was coming not necessarily from like the most progressive area in Florida. I'm from very South Florida. And we like didn't even have a GSA at my high school. We tried to implement one, and administration was like, no thanks. So it was not that I came from I wasn't discriminated against in high school for being gay. I was out and proud of it, and people were really nice about it for the most part. But when I came to UCF, I definitely was ignorant in a lot of places. I didn't know anything really about gender. I had dated someone who was gender nonconforming, but that was the extent of my knowledge about it. I didn't know about the asexuality community or the asexual community. My extent of knowledge regarding the LGBTQ plus community was very limited. And so I set out to join Lavender Council initially because I didn't have any friends on campus and I wanted to be friends with other gay people. But I got so much more out of it than I ever thought I would. I think self-education is the most important part of allyship, whether it's you're an ally because you're not in a community or you're an ally because you are in a community. And seeking out that knowledge is so important. And I met so many people on the council who were so diverse. We talk a lot about intersecting identities and the term intersectionality on Lavender Council. And that's the idea that you have all these different facets of yourself that intertwine and make you into a unique person who has a unique perspective and experience in life. So I had the opportunity to meet a lot of asexual people through my work with Lavender Council. There were also a couple people on the council who were asexual, and it just allowed me to have these really great eye-opening conversations with them. And obviously, you don't want to make the community itself responsible for your education solely, but by learning the material we teach, by attending safe zone trainings myself, and by asking questions when I didn't understand and asking them in respectful ways of people who actually were part of the asexual community, I was just able to foster this, I think, much more rich understanding of it. And honestly, I have even learned things today, having more further conversations with people who are ace. And that's the beauty of any community, is you can always grow and learn.
Yeah, I love that. And I definitely have been learning a lot on this podcast too. So I appreciate that. Going off of that, and Alexa, and of course, Jax, you can jump in too, as people who identify as ace. What is it like living in a hypersexualized society and not feel a sexual desire?
It's exhausting. So, it's very tiring, mostly because of the conflation of, desire being connected to someone's like worth as a person. So again, as I mentioned, I had partners that were like, oh, so you didn't find me attractive, and being attractive means I didn't like them. And if I didn't like them, that I didn't actually care about them. But everything just has to be so sexualized now. And I think that's one of the biggest, it's just exhausting kind of getting through media or advertisements, books. I'm talking like anywhere that I go, it's almost just everywhere. And it's not to say that it doesn't need to exist, or that, how I will say it is how Ava made the point, right, of intersectionality. And I think that it's fair to say that a lot of the hypersexuality is focused on a specific binary gender. And I think that perhaps one of the biggest reasons why I find it exhausting is because of the way that, women, and specifically cisgendered women, are sexualized in society, and like having to deal with that, the performance of, the expectations of all of these things. If I'm watching something be sold to me, like how is it being sold, and why is it that in books like that, why is it that 50 Shades of Grey was so popular and yet also like you couldn't talk about it? Like people who read it were trash. Like it was this trashy mentality, but yet it sold like millions of copies. So, for me, it's exhausting because I feel like it's an excuse to cover up some other bad behavior of our society. And that whenever I've come into these relationships or this communication now that I have from this different perspective, it forces me to say, like, do I not like this person because, I'm slut shaming, or is it that I'm, do I think that I have more morality somehow than someone else? Or it very much makes me focus on what it is that I'm actually complaining about whenever I'm saying something is too hypersexualized or something too like gratuitous or unnecessary.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with Jax. It's definitely hard just because you see everywhere in society. And I like to think of myself as someone who is sex positive. So if you're doing it yourself, go ahead, or, preaching for my clients, I'm definitely sex positive in that way. But it is still like difficult to see it, just in your everyday life and so many hidden, you know, just as we see it in general. But I was reading this book that I would definitely recommend. It's called Ace by Angela Chen, and it just came out recently, and I've been reading it. And she does give the two different concepts from a male and a female perspective who identify that way, where, yes, like there's a hypersexualized society, where men are using women, to sell, themselves with sex. But now there's just this concept of feminism. And sometimes, with being a feminist, this might be claiming back your body, being sexual, doing what you want, and, you see women like Cardi B or Megan Thee Stallion in pop culture and, showing you that it's okay to talk about sex. And I totally support this. Like, as a sex positive person, like I do, but then, it also promotes that hypersexualized society. So in order for a woman to be this strong, independent, feminist woman, that I need to engage in sex, or I need to, explore my sexuality more and be more in control. So someone who is ace, who sees stuff like that, it may make you feel less than of, or if you're a male, just with society saying that, you have to like enjoy sex. You should be having sex all the time or you're not a real man. There's just so many different aspects of, societal, influences, and then the people trying to change societal influences such as, feminism culture, but then it also kind of backfires still, where aces are still in this hypersexualized society and feeling exhausted, feeling like this is really hard just because this is all that is talked about in society, I feel like.
You both brought up a lot of amazing points that I want to acknowledge and kind of lift up about, it's interesting, this dichotomy between, because, we don't have an ace man on here. So I want to acknowledge that it does make sense what you brought up, Alexa, an issue of the expectation that they should want to have sex might be even more so on them because of societal standards. But also this interesting dichotomy of you can't be a strong, independent woman without owning your sexuality, and yet at the same time you are seen as, there's still slut shaming going on. There's a lot going on with that. And I think that could almost be another podcast, and maybe I shouldn't be opening this can of worms, but I do want to acknowledge that there's definitely something there about women owning their sexuality, and then how that can definitely alienate those who identify as women, who also identify as ace too. So that's really an important thing that you all brought up. So I really appreciate that. Jax, I wanted to ask you, how do you feel we could advocate for individuals that identify as ace on campus, and in our daily lives?
So on campus, it's always a very interesting conversation because I feel like it's a part of a taboo subject of, we're talking about student sex lives, right? I think realistically, a lot of it might have to center around, what is it called like Red Week or something. It's the highest rate of sexual assaults on campus.
Yeah, it's called the red zone. I just learned about this too because I had another podcast about it. But the red zone, you're right.
Yeah, so I think that there's this conversation of this, right, this expectation. And so if you have a brand new college student on campus who they might not even know that they're ace, and so they're trying to fit in, and they're at a party and they're flirting, and there's this expectation, and then this assault happens, right? So I think advocating, unfortunately, is tied into this mentality of this. The college doesn't necessarily, we're not going to dictate who people can go to bed with, but I think mostly it's going to be about this assault aspect, right? Of it's why asexuals do suffer some of the very same oppression as other LGBTQ individuals, of this concept of corrective rape, quote unquote, and this coercion, this expectation. And so advocating, I think, more is just supposed to be, I think at this moment we still have that problem to tackle first off. I think that within different LGBTQ spaces, it needs to be talked about more. So we've just now started in the student government office, there are caucuses. And so there's an LGBTQ plus caucus that I have been fortunate enough to be like the kind of staff advisor for. And I think it's just having that conversation of like, we need to make sure this language is inclusive and to make sure that we are including these people. I personally advocate through my own pride. So like one of my face masks while I'm on campus is the ACE flag. I have other queer identities, but I very much am very vocal about my ACE identity because of how silent it is and how forgotten, or how people do not accept it. So I just make it a point to show that I am ACE. And so I think mostly, asexuality itself kind of is in this tricky area for campuses as an institution, but on a personal level, I think it's to have that space for people to feel welcome. And so in LGBTQ spaces, it's about that education. And I will say I've gone through all of the safe zone training as a staff member, and being a part of this caucus and everything, and seeing the Lavender Council work. Like, it is very much like it's making sure that everyone is being represented, to have that space at the table, because the best way to get stuff done is to have the students do it. So allowing ACE individuals at the table where decisions are being made is the best way to advocate within an institution. So I think that's one way.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Alexa, Ava, do you want to jump in on how we can advocate for the ACE community in general?
Yeah, so I think that everything that Jax said was great. I completely agree. I think that it's really important to allow for spaces to have these conversations and have these dialogues, because it's one of the biggest ways that these issues can be brought up and hopefully eventually corrected, right? So more people can know about asexuality and respect it. I would say, as someone who isn't ACE, one of the things I try to do is make sure and recognize, one of the things we talk about in our advocates training is recognizing who is and who is not speaking in conversations. And unfortunately, especially within the LGBTQ plus community itself, ACE voices are not always heard and are not always welcomed to be heard. So for example, I'm on the Chief of Police Advisory Council. So I help bring up issues that I think involve the LGBTQ plus community and the relationship with the police. It's definitely a tricky position to be in because, our relationship with police has been sticky at best in our history. But whenever we have issues talked about that don't involve an identity I specifically associate with, or even if it is an identity I associate with, I would like to bring in the voices of people they do concern. So if there's trans issues brought up, I like to speak to other trans people. If there's issues regarding, anyone feeling safe on campus, I bring it to the council. I bring it to the council's friends. I think that's a really important thing, is to use your privilege to bring up the voices of people who are being silenced. So regardless of, right, if you're on a council or if you're in a club or if you're in a friend group, When issues are being discussed surrounding asexuality, making sure that asexual people are able to speak about it, because when you're speaking for a community you don't belong to, it can be really easy to miss the entire point or bring up ideas that you don't fully understand. So yeah, making sure, I think Jack said it earlier, everyone has a seat at the table means everybody has a seat at the table and they get to speak for who they are and the communities they belong to.
I love that. Yeah. And I would invite everyone to who would like to be a better advocate to definitely do your research and educate yourself. And part of that research is looking into your own privilege. And privilege is layered, right? And we talked about intersectionality. You can be privileged in one identity and not the other. And then within a community that is marginalized, like the LGBTQ plus community is, there's privilege within that too. And Alexa, you talked a little bit about how ACE can be that way. And actually, can I go back to that? Can you talk a little bit about how, when you brought that up, what were you mentioning on how ACE can be privileged in that sense? I wanted to ask about that, Alexa.
It just kind of maybe it's in more of an invisible kind of identity where, no one really knows you're ace until you're in a relationship with that person or start talking to that person, or that person is saying that they're ace. The fact that it's not talked about a lot, that a lot of people don't know about it, that maybe other people in the LGBTQ plus community can say, well, you might have a much more privilege because when someone sees me, they might think I'm a heterosexual cisgender female. No one knows that I'm ace unless I tell them I'm ace. So in that way, I'm protective because my aceness isn't seen physically. Someone only knows I'm ace within a more intimate part of, my inner circle. Or if I choose to say that I'm ace, of course, I can, I am putting myself out there, to facing maybe discrimination and things like that from other people. But I do think it's important to advocate more, just like Jax was saying. But that's my interpretation of how come maybe it is more not looked up as highly in the LGBTQ plus community.
I appreciate that. And I think that also, we can also add how privilege can, you can, again, layered, right? It could be a privilege in one sense and not privilege because no one talks about ACE too. So it's a lot of different things. And like you were mentioning, Ava, of being us kind of looking inward and also learning from each other, but also looking inward and using our privilege to lift up those and making sure that they're at the table. I just want to lift that aspect of it too. So I appreciate that. Ava, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I actually really like the way Alexa just described that, because, in a sense, being invisible is both a privilege and a disprivilege. There can be a big stigma surrounding people, and how they pass in the community. For example, I, regardless of whether I agree with stereotypes or not, I'm someone who could be looked at and people would assume I'm cis and straight. I don't look gay, and inherently looking gay or looking trans, that's a microaggression, and we need to disband it as a community and as a society as a whole. But regardless of whether or not I agree with those stereotypes, it's a fact. I look straight and cis, and a lot of people don't assume my involvement with the LGBT community just by how I look. And that can be a privilege and a disadvantage at times, right? Because I'm proud of my identity. It can prevent me sometimes by being recognized by my peers in the community. And I think that's part of what Alexa was talking about too, right? It's almost like the safety blanket over you when you're out in the world. People don't necessarily target you in terms of hate crime or discrimination. But then it can also be a disadvantage when you're, as a part of the community, you're not necessarily the first to be heard in those kinds of situations. And that can be very harmful to your own relationship with your identity and your own relationship to the community as a whole.
I love that you put it like that too, Ava, how it's like a disadvantage as well because, just being ace, of course I'm in the LGBTQ plus community, but it's also kind of like I'm in an in-between. And I'm not sure if any other asexuals feel this way, but it also feels like, you're not totally accepted in the LGBTQ plus community. And then also in, where everyone else is, you don't feel like you fit somewhere, and I do find comfort in like ace groups, and we kind of have our own community within just the asexuality groups, whether it's like through Facebook or social media or Avon is, the ace site, which I would definitely look into if you're someone who wants to learn a little bit more about asexuality, but it's hard to feel connected in the community. So I'm glad that asexuality has its own inner community in the LGBTQ plus community.
Thank you so much, everyone who joined this conversation. I really appreciate everything that you all brought up. Once again, I've learned so much. But before we sign off, is there anything Ava, Jax, or Alexa want to bring up regarding asexuality that we may not have covered, or anything else that you'd like to highlight before we sign off?
I just like to always remind listeners, whether you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community or not, whether you're ace or not, and whether you fully understand asexuality after this podcast or not, regardless of what you understand or what you identify as, you can respect someone else's identity without fully understanding it. You can do research on your own to be more knowledgeable about those identities. So yeah, respect people's pronouns, respect people's sexuality, respect their gender, just respect people as a whole. And that's just the last point I like to bring up.
Always a good point, Ava. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and I love that. And I'm so excited that like we did this podcast. I know like I said it, briefly in another podcast, and then, Emilie came up to me and asked me if I wanted to do an asexuality podcast. And I'm so glad that we did one, just so we can spread the word more about asexuality. And, like that statistic you said, that's 1%, definitely much higher because a lot of people don't know about it. So the more that we talk about it, the more, we're going to feel more included, within the community. And then just as the world as a whole, and just to take from what, you learned today as the viewer that's listening, it's just to know that whatever you identify with is valid. And if you're confused, that's okay. Like, I think Ava or Jax was saying, it's a journey, and it's going to take some time, but knowing that, sexuality is fluid and, that's okay.
I love that. And I think that that's a wonderful place to sign off, unless you had something you wanted to say, Jax.
My identity is just aces.
Got it. I appreciate that. So I just wanted to thank the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear. You are not alone. And thank you, Ava, Alexa, and Jax, so much for being here with me today on this podcast.